Halloween had always been my favorite holiday. Growing up, I had fond memories of dressing up as a kid, running through the neighborhood collecting candy until my bag was too heavy to carry. Even as an adult, I held on to that joy. My house was always the most decorated on the block, complete with fake cobwebs, skeletons, and a glowing graveyard in the yard. This year was no different. I had spent the whole day making sure everything was perfect. By the time dusk rolled around, the first wave of trick-or-treaters came, their laughter and excitement echoing down the street. I greeted them at the door with a big bowl of candy and a warm smile, complimenting costumes and pretending to be scared when the occasional kid jumped out to spook me. By 9 p.m., the streets had started to empty. Most of the kids were home, likely sorting through their loot, and the teens had moved on to parties. My porch light was still on, but I was ready to call it a night. The candy bowl was almost empty, and my favorite horror movie was queued up on the TV. Just as I stood to turn off the porch light, I heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected. Most trick-or-treaters rang the bell, and by this hour, I figured the stragglers would have given up. I grabbed the candy bowl, now holding only a handful of treats, and opened the door. What greeted me wasn't a group of kids, or even teens. It was a man. He stood in the doorway, dressed in a grey hoodie and jeans. His hood was pulled low over his face, and the porch light cast deep shadows, making it hard to see his features. He wasn't holding a bag, and he didn't say anything at first. "Trick or treat," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He wasn't smiling, wasn't playful. His presence felt wrong. Still, I didn't want to be rude. Maybe he was just an older brother collecting candy for a sibling, I thought. Sure," I said, holding out the bowl. He didn't move to take any candy. He just stood there, staring at me. "Is there something else I can help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head slightly, as though studying me. "You're alone tonight, aren't you?" The question hit me like a cold slap. My stomach tightened, and I felt my grip on the candy bowl falter. It was such a strange, invasive thing to say, and his tone wasn't curious. It was deliberate, almost taunting. "I'm just about to wrap up for the night," I said, stepping back slightly. "If you're not here for candy, I think you should leave." His expression changed. The corners of his mouth dropped, and his face went blank. He stepped closer to the door, his movements slow and deliberate. "I saw your light was still on," he said. "I thought you might like some company." My heart was pounding now. I tried to keep calm, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to get away from the door. I pushed it closed slightly, but before I could shut it, he stuck his foot in the gap. "Wait," he said, his tone sharper now. "I didn't get my candy." The bowl slipped from my hand, spilling the remaining candy onto the floor. I stumbled back a step, my eyes darting toward the kitchen, where I'd left a knife earlier, while carving pumpkins. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice louder and more forceful this time. His smile returned, but it was different now, wider, unnatural, like he was enjoying my fear. "Don't be rude," he said. "It's Halloween." I didn't wait for him to make the next move. I slammed the door as hard as I could, throwing my weight against it. He pushed back for a moment, but I managed to shove it shut and lock the deadbolt. I stood there, shaking, my ear pressed to the door. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then a slow, deliberate knock. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice muffled through the door. I didn't move until I heard his footsteps retreating down the porch stairs. Even then, I stayed frozen, clutching the doorknob like it was the only thing keeping me safe. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the knife, and called the police. My voice was shaking as I explained what had happened. They said they'd send someone to patrol the area, but they didn't sound particularly concerned. "Probably just a prank," the dispatcher said. But it didn't feel like a prank. I stayed up the rest of the night, all the lights in the house blazing. I checked the locks on the doors and windows over and over, my heart jumping at every creak or rustle outside. The police never found him. They told me there weren't any other reports of strange activity in the neighborhood, but that didn't comfort me. Whoever he was, he knew I was alone, and he wanted me to know that he knew. It's been a year, and I still think about that night. I moved to a new place, a gated apartment complex with security cameras. I haven't decorated for Halloween since. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think I hear it, the faint, deliberate knock at my door. And I wonder if one day he'll come back. Halloween was always my favorite holiday. The costumes, the candy, the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of leaves and wood smoke. It was all perfect. This year, though, I had no plans. My friends were either busy or didn't feel like doing anything, and I didn't have kids of my own to take trick-or-treating. So, I decided to take a drive through the old neighborhood. The streets looked like they had when I was a kid, though a bit less lively. The houses were still lined with carved pumpkins and fake cobwebs, and kids darted around in their costumes, clutching candy buckets and laughing. But there were fewer houses with their porch lights on, and many driveways were empty. I drove slowly, caught between nostalgia and a strange unease. Maybe it was just seeing how much quieter the neighborhood had become. I turned onto a street that ran past the local park, its wide, open space bordered by tall, skeletal trees. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the park, near the swings, wearing a red hoodie and jeans. Her candy bucket hung from one hand, nearly empty. She was alone, which immediately struck me as odd. No parent, no group of kids, just her, staring into the park like she was waiting for something. I slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. Her head snapped toward me, and for a moment she just stared. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Where's your group?" "Your parents?" "I don't know," she said quietly. Her voice was so soft I had to strain to hear it. I pulled over, leaving the engine running, and stepped out of the car. "You're out here by yourself?" She nodded again, her eyes flicking back toward the park. "Do you want me to help you find them?" She hesitated, then said, "I think they're in there." She pointed into the dark expanse of the park. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach twist. The park was nearly pitch black, with only the faint light from distant street lamps filtering through the trees. It had always been a little eerie at night, even when I was a kid. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Do you have a phone? Maybe we can call someone." She shook her head, clutching the candy bucket tighter. I should have called the police right then. I should have gotten back in my car and driven away. But she looked so scared, and I couldn't just leave her there. "Okay," I said, trying to sound confident. "Let's go find them." I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the gravel path that wound through the park. The girl walked ahead of me, her footsteps barely making a sound. "Wait up," I said, quickening my pace. "Stay close, okay?" She didn't respond, just kept moving toward the swings. The farther we went, the quieter it got. The distant hum of Halloween festivities faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of the old swing set. "Hey," I said, trying to break the silence. "What's your name?" She stopped abruptly and turned to look at me. "It's Emily." "Okay, Emily," I said. "Do you know where your parents are?" She shook her head again. Her eyes darted to something behind me, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint outlines of the playground equipment. When I looked back, Emily was walking toward the swings again. "Emily, wait," I called, but she didn't stop. That's when I saw him. A man stepped out from behind the swings, his silhouette barely visible in the weak glow of my flashlight. He was tall, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his face hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. "Hey," I shouted, stepping forward. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Emily by the arm, pulling her close. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The man didn't speak. His grip on Emily tightened, and I saw something glint in his other hand, a knife. Panic surged through me. "Let her go," I yelled. He smirked a cold, twisted grin, and for a moment, I thought he was going to attack. But then, in a sudden, violent motion, he shoved Emily toward me and took off into the trees. Emily stumbled into my arms, trembling. "Are you okay?" I asked, my heart pounding. She nodded, but tears streamed down her face. I called 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The dispatcher told me to stay put, and within minutes, the park was swarming with police. They searched the area with flashlights and dogs, but the man was long gone. They never found him. Emily's parents arrived shortly after. They had been searching for her all night, frantic. She had wandered off from her group while trick-or-treating, and the man must have been following her for some time. I stayed until the police told me I could go. As I drove home, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's grin, the way he'd looked at me, like he wasn't afraid of being caught. I don't drive through that neighborhood anymore, and I haven't celebrated Halloween since. Halloween had always been my favorite night of the year. There was something magical about the crisp autumn air, the glow of jack-o'-lanterns on porches, and the chatter of kids rushing from house to house with pillowcases full of candy. But that Halloween, one I'll never forget, was different. It wasn't the decorations or the weather. It was a feeling, subtle but persistent, that something wasn't right. I was 15 that year, too old to trick-or-treat, and not cool enough to score an invite to the high school Halloween party. Instead, I was stuck babysitting my little brother, Ben. He was only 8, and still at that age where Halloween was everything. Ben's costume that year was a scarecrow. Mom had made the mask herself, stitching burlap into a crude face with black thread. The uneven stitching gave it a sinister look, and the hollowed-out eye holes were unnervingly dark. Ben loved it. I hated it. "Isn't it awesome?" he'd said, pulling the mask on earlier that evening. "Yeah," I lied, shuddering. "Super creepy." The night started like any other. Ben darted from house to house, his small legs pumping with excitement as he collected candy. I trailed behind, occasionally calling out for him to slow down. The first few streets were lively, filled with kids in colorful costumes and adults chatting on their porches. But as we turned onto Oakwood Drive, the energy shifted. The houses here were older, set farther apart, with only a few porch lights on. Most were dark, their windows reflecting nothing but the eerie glow of the moon. "Let's skip this street," I said, feeling uneasy. Ben ignored me, of course. He sprinted toward the last house on the block, a weathered, two-story structure that looked abandoned. Its paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The only sign of life was a jack-o'-lantern on the porch, its crooked grin flickering in the dim light of a single candle. "Ben, wait!" I called, jogging to catch up. He was already halfway up the driveway, his burlap mask bobbing as he ran. "Come on," I said when I caught up. "This house is empty. Let's go." "The pumpkin's lit," Ben argued, pointing to the jack-o'-lantern. "That means they have candy." Before I could stop him, he was on the porch, knocking on the door. "Trick or treat," he shouted. Nothing happened. The house was silent, the door looming over us like a shadow. "Ben, no one's home," I said, reaching for his arm. Then the door creaked open. Ben froze. I stared at the dark gap, half expecting someone to appear. A friendly face, maybe an old lady with a bowl of candy. But no one was there. "Trick or treat." Ben called again, louder this time. Still nothing. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing his arm. That's when we heard it. "Nice mask," a voice whispered from the darkness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was raspy, like someone struggling to breathe, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Thank you," Ben said, oblivious to the tone of the voice. I yanked him back, harder this time. "We're going. Now." Ben hesitated, his gaze fixed on the open door. But then he let me drag him away. As we hurried down the street, I glanced back. The door was still ajar, and the jack-o'-lantern's light flickered wildly, casting strange shadows on the porch. We didn't stop until we were home. That night, after Ben went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I double-checked the locks, peered through the windows, and even stood in the yard, staring into the darkness. But everything seemed normal, until I went to bed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was coming from inside the house. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was faint but distinct, like fabric brushing against the floor. I got up and crept to Ben's room. He was asleep, sprawled out under his covers, but something was missing. His scarecrow mask, which had been sitting on his desk, was gone. I searched the house, checking every room and closet. I even went outside to see if he'd dropped it in the yard. But it wasn't anywhere. The next morning, when I asked Ben about it, he just shrugged. "I don't remember taking it off," he said. "That should have been the end of it." But it wasn't. A few days later, I overheard Mom talking to a neighbor. A boy from the next town over had gone missing on Halloween night. He was 8, the same age as Ben, and his parents said the last time they saw him, he was wearing a homemade mask. The story sent a shiver through me, but I tried to shake it off. It was a coincidence. That's all. Then, a week later, they found the boy's body. He was in an abandoned field on the edge of town. His mask was lying next to him, torn and stained. I didn't tell Ben. I didn't want to scare him. But every time I thought about that night, the voice, the open door, the missing mask, I felt sick. Someone had been in that house. Someone had been watching us. And someone, I was sure, had been watching Ben.